The moment Margaret Harper saw the girl's necklace, her breath caught like a wave against the rocks. 1 second, she was reaching for her wine glass. The next, she was staring, frozen, silent, at the gold pendant shaped like a radiant sun, its center etched with a single letter, S. 24-year-old Ethan Harper stood proudly beside her, his smile easy, his voice full of warmth. "Mom, this is Sophie Lane." Sophie offered a gentle smile, her tone calm despite the subtle tension settling over the room. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Harper." Margaret didn't answer. Her gaze didn't move from the necklace. Under the table, Atlas, the Harper's blind German shepherd, lifted his head, nostrils flaring, as if the small piece of gold carried a scent from a life he had not forgotten. The late summer evening draped Harborview, Oregon, in a palette of molten gold and deepening violet, the last rays of sunlight spilling across the jagged cliffs, where the Harper estate stood like a sentinel over the Pacific. The ocean below churned and hissed, each wave curling into white foam before shattering against the rocks, sending a cool mist up toward the weathered cedar walls of the three-story home. The wind carried with it the tang of salt and the faint calls of gulls, and through the tall windows of the dining room, the amber light of sunset mingled with the warm glow of chandelier bulbs. The table was set for 4, polished silverware catching glints of light, crystal glasses waiting in perfect symmetry. Beneath the table, Atlas, the Harper's German shepherd, lay quietly at his place, his large body curled in a way that still conveyed an alertness honed from years of service. At 7 years old, Atlas was a magnificent dog, even in blindness. His thick sable and tan coat was brushed to a healthy sheen, his ears still erect and responsive to every sound, and his clouded eyes hidden behind a neatly tied white silk scarf that served as both a comfort and a marker of his condition. Once a search and rescue dog, renowned for his precision and courage, Atlas had lost his sight in a collapsed tunnel during a rescue mission. But even without vision, his nose and ears were sharp enough to map his world. Since his injury, he had grown more reserved, rarely initiating contact with strangers, preferring the quiet company of those he trusted. His occasional soft whine when silverware clinked against porcelain tonight was not from discomfort, but from sensing the undercurrent of anticipation in the room. At the far end of the table sat Margaret Harper, 43, a woman whose presence was as commanding as the view from her cliffside home. Tall, with the poise of someone born into old money, but tempered by decades of discipline, she carried herself with an elegance that seemed unshakable. Her auburn hair, streaked faintly with silver, was pinned in a flawless chignon, and her eyes, emerald green and watchful, had a way of assessing people before they spoke. Margaret was known in Harborview as a benefactor to various charities, her name engraved on hospital wings and scholarship plaques, yet her generosity was matched by a reserve that kept most at arm's length. A private heartbreak in her early 20s, spoken of by no one and recalled by her only in the silence of night, had taught her the cost of vulnerability, and she had built her life upon a foundation of control, measured words, and impeccable appearances. Across from her, Ethan Harper, her only son at 24, was all youthful warmth and open energy, a contrast to his mother's cool composure. He had inherited her eyes but not her guarded nature. His sandy blonde hair, perpetually untidy no matter how he combed it, framed a face lit by a smile that made people feel at ease. Athletic from years of sailing and hiking along the coast, he wore his privilege without arrogance, preferring to spend time volunteering at community centers rather than indulging in the exclusivity of Harborview's yacht clubs. He had the sort of earnestness that made others underestimate him at first glance, only to find later that he was perceptive in ways that mattered. Tonight, that earnestness carried a flicker of excitement. His knee bounced beneath the table, his eyes flicking toward the entrance whenever he heard a sound from the hallway. The moment finally came when the front door opened, ushering in a breath of ocean air and the muted scent of rain from the horizon. Stepping into the dining room was Sophie Lane, 23, her presence neither loud nor timid, but quietly assured. Sophie was a mixed heritage, her warm brown skin catching the chandelier's light as though it held a soft glow of its own. She stood at an average height, her posture upright yet unforced, a blend of self-respect and resilience. Her hair, dark and naturally curly, was drawn into a loose bun at the nape of her neck, with a few rebellious strands framing a face marked by delicate cheekbones and eyes the shade of rich coffee. Those eyes were watchful, yet kind, the eyes of someone who had learned to read people quickly and carefully. Dressed in dark jeans and a cream blouse layered with a silver-gray cardigan, she had chosen attire that was simple but polished, the kind that wouldn't offend the formality of the Harper table while still feeling like her own skin. Sophie's history was etched subtly in the way she carried herself. Years in the foster system had instilled independence, and teaching coding to underprivileged kids had given her a grounded purpose. She had known instability, but it had not hardened her. Instead, it had carved out a deep patience and a quiet determination. "Mom, Dad," Ethan began, though his father was away on business that evening. "This is Sophie Lane. We met while volunteering at the tech literacy program for kids over at the community center." His voice brimmed with pride, as if Sophie's presence here was both an introduction and a statement of his own values. Sophie offered a warm smile to Margaret, her voice steady, despite sensing the faint edge of formality in the air. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Harper. I've heard so much about your work here in Harborview." Margaret's reply never came. Instead, her gaze fixed on Sophie's collarbone, where the low neckline of her blouse revealed a gold pendant in the shape of a radiant sun, its rays delicately etched, and, in its center, a single letter, S, engraved in an elegant, old-fashioned script. For a moment, Margaret's mind went blank, the conversation fading under the rush of her own heartbeat in her ears. She had seen that pendant before. She owned one exactly like it, hidden away for over 2 decades in the bottom of a locked cedar box in her closet. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the stem of her wine glass, and in that small tremor, the crystal wobbled dangerously, nearly spilling its ruby contents onto the pristine white tablecloth. It was Atlas who broke the stillness. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching toward Sophie, nostrils flaring as if the air around her carried a scent he knew. Slowly, deliberately, Atlas rose from his place, his paws silent on the hardwood floor. He navigated around the table with a precision born of muscle memory and instinct, the tip of his nose leading him directly to Sophie's side. Without hesitation, he pressed his muzzle lightly to the pendant, inhaling deeply before releasing a low, almost questioning whine, a sound Margaret had not heard from him in years when meeting someone for the first time. Sophie glanced down, surprised, and instinctively reached to pet him, her fingers brushing the thick fur at the base of his neck. "Hello there," she said softly, her tone warm and unguarded. Atlas leaned into her touch, a rare act of trust from the dog, who usually kept his distance from strangers. Ethan chuckled lightly, looking from Sophie to his mother. "Well, that's a first. He never does that with new people." Margaret's expression was unreadable, but inside, a fissure had opened, one that the sun-shaped pendant and a blind dog's recognition had just widened. Margaret left the dining room without a word, the sound of her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood as she ascended the sweeping staircase toward the second floor. The glow of the setting sun dimmed behind her, shadows stretching long across the hallway lined with framed photographs. Most of Ethan as a child, sailing or laughing on the beach, each image capturing the life she had chosen to present to the world. Her room, at the end of the hall, was a study in order. Muted cream walls, a bed dressed in crisp linens, and a wardrobe carved from mahogany. She moved straight to it, pulling open the right-hand door and reaching into the back where a false panel concealed a narrow compartment. From within, she withdrew a small cedar box, its surface worn smooth with age but still faintly scented of the tree from which it was carved. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned by faded velvet, lay a gold sun pendant identical to Sophie's, though this one bore small scratches across its rays, the marks of years spent hidden. Her gaze lingered on the engraving at its center, N.S., etched in the same looping script, before her breath caught and memory swept her backward. 22 years earlier, Margaret had been 21, her auburn hair whipping across her face in the teeth of a winter storm. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the cliffside roads slick and treacherous, the beam of the Harborview lighthouse flashing through the darkness like a metronome for her pounding heart. In her arms, wrapped in a pale blanket, was a baby girl no more than 5 days old. her tiny breaths warm against Margaret's skin. Tears blurred her vision as she approached the weathered wooden steps of the Harborview Children's Shelter. The single light above its door, a faint promise in the chaos of the storm. She placed the child carefully on the stoop, tucking the blanket securely around her and slipping the gold sun pendant beneath the folds. A final glance, a choked sob, and then Margaret turned, the echo of her boots on the wet pavement, swallowed by the roar of the sea. She did not look back. The memory fractured, dissolving into the muted silence of her bedroom. Margaret closed the box and slid it back into its hiding place, her fingers lingering on the panel as though she could seal away the past once more. She steadied herself, smoothing her skirt before descending the stairs, careful to compose her features into the cool neutrality she wore like armor. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Sophie sat across from Ethan, her posture relaxed but her eyes attentive as she spoke. "The necklace," she said, touching it lightly. "It's the only thing I had from before. I grew up in Harborview Foster Home, just a few miles from here. I don't remember anyone giving it to me. It was there from the beginning." Her voice was even, but the faintest shadow crossed her expression, the kind that comes from a lifetime of unanswered questions. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "And you teach coding now, right? That's amazing." His smile was open, but he was studying her, sensing that the story of her past was far deeper than she let on. Atlas, lying near the corner of the room, stirred again. He lifted his head, ears swiveling toward Sophie's voice, and rose to his feet. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though he were making a decision. Padding over to her side, he gently placed one massive paw on her knee. The contact startled Sophie for a second before she softened, resting her hand over his. The silky scarf that covered his eyes shifted slightly, revealing the pale cloudiness beneath. She didn't recoil. If anything, her touch grew gentler, her fingertips brushing the fur at his paw. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Atlas must think he knows you from another life. He doesn't warm up to people this fast." Sophie smiled faintly. "Maybe he just knows I like him." She scratched the fur under his chin, and Atlas leaned in with a low sigh, a sound of trust. From the doorway, Margaret stood unnoticed, her hand resting against the cool frame. She watched the exchange, the way Sophie's fingers lingered on Atlas's fur, the easy warmth in her smile, and something deep in Margaret's chest shifted. It was not just guilt that rose in her. It was fear, sharp and sudden, fear of the truth pressing too close, of the past refusing to stay buried. She turned away before either of them could see her footsteps silent against the hall rug. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the tall windows of the Harper dining room, carrying with it the briny scent of the Pacific and the distant crash of waves. The remnants of dinner sat cooling on their plates, but conversation had thinned into a stillness, heavy enough to make the chandelier's faint hum noticeable. Margaret's eyes, usually so controlled, lingered on Sophie a moment too long before she set down her fork with deliberate care. "Sophie," she said, her tone mild yet probing, "have you ever tried to find your birth parents?" Her question floated over the table like a pebble dropped into still water, small but impossible to ignore. Sophie's fingers instinctively moved to the sun pendant at her collarbone. She hesitated, the air in her lungs suddenly sharp before speaking. "I did," she said quietly. "About 3 years ago. I filed a request for my non-identifying records. It wasn't much, just a way to maybe find some thread to follow." She drew a breath, her voice thinner now. "A week later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no signature. Just one line, typed, 'Stop digging. Some graves are sealed for a reason.'" The words hung in the air, chilling in their simplicity. Ethan straightened in his chair, his brow creasing. "Someone actually sent you that?" Sophie nodded, a faint tremor in her hands. "It scared me. I was only 20. I told myself maybe there was danger, or maybe the truth would hurt more than it would help. So I stopped." She gave a tight, self-deprecating smile. "Maybe that was cowardly. Or maybe it was just survival." Across from her, Ethan glanced at his mother, catching the subtle tension in Margaret's jaw, the faint flicker in her eyes. It wasn't the look of idle curiosity. It was recognition. That realization planted something in Ethan's mind, a seed of suspicion that made his stomach tighten. "Do you know anything about that?" he asked his mother. Margaret reached for her water glass, taking her time before answering. "No," she said simply, her tone cool enough to close the subject. But for Ethan, the evasion was obvious, and it lodged itself firmly in his thoughts. Later that evening, the house had grown quiet. Ethan stood in the dimly lit hallway, arms folded, watching as Atlas padded slowly from the living room toward the glass doors leading to the back porch. The big German shepherd moved with the careful steps of one who had memorized every inch of the floor plan. Ethan leaned against the doorframe as Atlas nosed the door until it clicked open enough for him to slip outside. The night air rolled in, salt, damp wood, and the faint sound of the sea. Ethan followed him out, barefoot on the cold planks. Atlas moved to the edge of the porch and lifted his head toward the dark horizon, the lighthouse beam sweeping across the water in measured intervals. Then, as if on some private cue, Atlas let out 3 low, deliberate barks. He paused, ears swiveling, then stood in stillness before retreating back inside. The next afternoon, Ethan took Atlas on a walk through the winding coastal trail that bordered their property. Halfway down the slope, they met Tom Riley, the Harper's neighbor. Tom was in his late 60s, wiry but strong, his weathered skin and crow's feet telling of decades spent in salt air and sun. He wore a faded fisherman's cap and carried himself with the relaxed gait of someone who had long ago stopped rushing for anything. A retired rescue diver, Tom was well known in Harborview for his role in dozens of coastal emergencies. Spotting Atlas, he smiled faintly. "Haven't seen you in a while, old boy," he said, his voice warm and rough-edged. Ethan asked if Tom had known Atlas before the Harpers adopted him. Tom's expression shifted, softening in a way that carried respect. "Knew him? Son, that dog was a legend. 8 years ago, there was a collapse in a sea cave north of here. A bunch of kids trapped after the tide came in fast. Atlas went in with his handler, Michael Lane. The dog pulled out every one of those kids, lost his sight when a support beam gave way. And Michael didn't make it out." Ethan crouched beside Atlas, scratching behind his ear. "Michael Lane," he repeated. Something about the name tugged at a distant thread in his mind. He turned to Tom. "What was he like?" Tom's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Solid man, mid-30s, tall, dark hair, carried himself like someone who'd seen trouble but never let it bend him. He was the kind who'd rather save a stranger than himself. And Atlas, he never stopped looking for him. That evening, over coffee in the Harper kitchen, Ethan casually mentioned Tom's story to Sophie. The moment he said Michael Lane, Sophie froze. Her cup halted midair, her eyes wide. "Michael Lane," she echoed. That's my foster dad, at least for a while. He took me in when I was 11. He was the only one who ever felt like family. He died when I was 14. She set the cup down carefully, her voice caught between disbelief and something raw. "I had no idea he was a rescue handler. No one ever told me that." "And you're saying Atlas knew him?" Ethan nodded, watching her face shift as pieces she'd never had before began to slot into place. Atlas, as if sensing the connection, moved to Sophie's side, resting his head against her thigh. She laid a hand on his neck, her fingers curling into his fur. "He remembers you," Ethan said quietly, though he knew Atlas's recognition ran deeper. It was the smell, the echo of Michael Lane carried in the faintest traces Sophie had unknowingly brought with her. Sophie swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. Then, "He's the last one who remembers him the way I do." From the doorway, Margaret stood half hidden in shadow, the words, "Michael Lane," reverberating in her mind, stirring an unease she couldn't entirely name. 2 threads, Sophie's mysterious warning to stop searching, and Atlas's bond to a man from her foster past, were beginning to twist together, and Margaret knew they were leading toward a truth she had worked her whole adult life to keep buried. The wind had shifted by the time they reached the narrow streets of South Harborview, bringing with it the electric charge of an approaching storm. Low clouds rolled in from the Pacific, the lighthouse beam cutting a pale arc through the deepening gloom. Rain spattered the windshield as Ethan pulled his mother's dark sedan into a cramped parking space outside Sophie's apartment building. The structure was old but well kept, its red brick facade darkened by decades of sea air. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of salt and coffee, a mix that came from the cafe on the ground floor and the ocean only 2 blocks away. Sophie led the way, her steps steady though there was a tension in her shoulders. Her apartment was small but bright. The walls lined with thrift store shelves crammed with programming manuals, worn paperbacks, and a few framed photographs. A potted fern sat in the corner by the single tall window, its leaves trembling slightly from the draft. The furniture was simple, a second-hand couch, a small wooden desk made from stacked crates, and an old trunk that doubled as a coffee table. On one shelf, a ceramic lighthouse stood among her books, its paint chipped but intact. "It's in here," Sophie said quietly, crossing to the bedroom. She knelt beside the bed, reaching underneath to pull out a fireproof lockbox. From it, she took a slim manila folder and handed it to Margaret. Margaret's hands, usually so steady, trembled as she opened the folder. The first page was a hospital intake form, its ink faded but still legible. Female, infant, approximately 5 days old, found abandoned near Harborview Lighthouse, wearing gold sun pendant. Caller described as female, Northern American accent, approximately 20 to 25 years of age. Margaret's breath caught, her fingers curled around the paper until the edges bent. She could hear the rain now, tapping harder against the window, the first hints of the storm's voice. Ethan leaned over to look, his eyes moving from the paper to his mother's pale face. "Mom?" he asked, but Margaret didn't answer. She was too busy forcing herself to keep breathing, each inhale sharp and shallow. In the corner, Atlas had been quietly sniffing around, his paws soundless on the hardwood floor. Suddenly, he moved to the front door, pressing his nose against the seam, and began to scratch, lightly at first, then with urgency. A low, insistent bark rumbled in his chest, followed by another and another, each one pointed toward the street outside. Sophie frowned and went to open the door, but before she could, a knock came. Standing there was Tom Riley, rain dripping from the brim of his old fisherman's cap, his weather-beaten coat speckled with droplets. "Storm's coming in fast," he said, stepping inside without ceremony. He glanced at Atlas. "What's got him stirred up?" Atlas barked again, then trotted out into the hallway, turning to make sure Tom was following. The old man gave Ethan a look that was half curiosity, half caution, and then went after the dog. Sophie, Ethan, and Margaret trailed behind, the smell of rain growing stronger with every step. Atlas led them down the block to a narrow alley tucked between 2 storage buildings. The wind funneled through it, carrying the metallic tang of rust and the damp smell of old wood. At the far end, half hidden by a leaning fence, was a weathered storage shed. Its padlock hung broken, the door creaking on its hinges. Inside, dust motes swirled in the dim light from a cracked window. Old rescue equipment was stacked in careless piles, ropes, harnesses, and a couple of helmets with faded decals. In the corner, on top of a dented metal cabinet, lay a collar, thick leather, worn smooth with use, and on the brass tag, the name Michael Lane. Sophie's breath caught, and she reached for it with shaking hands. Beneath the collar was a small water-stained notebook. Tom took it down carefully and handed it to her. "Better you read this," he said. The handwriting inside was bold, the ink smudged in places but still readable. Sophie flipped through until a passage stopped her cold. "Took in a girl today from the shelter. They say she's been here since she was a newborn. Gold sun pendant around her neck. Something in her eyes. She's been through more than she knows. I'll keep her safe." Sophie's throat tightened, and she had to press her palm to her mouth to keep from crying out. "That's me," she whispered. "He's talking about me." Outside, the storm was arriving in full force. Sheets of rain hammering against the shed's tin roof, wind howling through the gaps in the boards. Lightning flashed, illuminating Margaret's face, her composure cracking as tears welled in her eyes. She turned away, but the sound of Sophie's voice reading Michael's words made her shoulders tremble. Thunder rolled, deep and resonant, masking the sound of a quiet sob. Tom looked from Margaret to Sophie, then to Ethan, as if weighing the magnitude of what they had just uncovered. Atlas moved to Sophie's side again, pressing his head into her leg as though anchoring her in place. She bent to wrap her arms around his neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against the chaos outside. In that small, dim shed, two separate threads of truth had converged: Sophie's origins and Atlas's unwavering link to Michael Lane. And as the storm raged over Harborview, those truths refused to be buried any longer. The morning broke with a pale wash of light over Harborview, the storm of the previous night now reduced to a distant whisper over the horizon. The sea, still restless, rolled in long swells that broke into white lace along the dark cliffs. Margaret stood on the rocky bluff just beyond the Harper estate, her coat pulled tight against the lingering chill. In her hand, she clutched an envelope, creased, opened, and read more times than she could count since it had arrived 2 days earlier. Inside, the crisp white pages bore the DNA results that confirmed what she already suspected. Sophie Lane, 99.9% probability of direct maternal relationship to Margaret Harper. No paternal relationship to Ethan Harper. The words were clinical, detached, and yet they struck like a tolling bell that resonated through every fiber of her being. Ethan stood beside her, his jaw set, but his expression soft. He had read the results too, and though 1,000 unspoken questions flickered in his eyes, he held them back. Behind them, Sophie approached across the damp grass, the rising sun gilding the edges of her curls. She wore her cream cardigan buttoned against the breeze, the gold sun pendant glinting just above the neckline. Her steps slowed as she reached Margaret, who turned and, without hesitation, extended a small velvet box. Inside was another pendant, its gold a shade warmer with age, the rays slightly worn, the same letter S carved at its center. "It was always meant for you," Margaret said, her voice low, each word shaped by the weight of 2 lost decades. "I kept it, even when I thought I would never see you again. I'm sorry it took me this long to give it back." Sophie's fingers closed over the pendant, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and ache. She didn't speak at first, only nodded and took a slow breath, as if memorizing the feel of the moment. Atlas padded forward, the white silk scarf still covering his eyes. At 7 years old, his movements had grown deliberate, but there was still strength in his frame. Sophie knelt in the grass, untying the knot at the back of his head. The scarf slipped free, revealing his clouded eyes, pale, unseeing, yet somehow alight in the morning sun. He lifted his head toward the ocean, nostrils flaring to catch the scent of salt and kelp, ears twitching as the waves crashed below. Sophie rested a hand against his cheek. "Michael would be proud of both of us," she said softly. The dog's tail thumped once against the ground, as if in agreement. 3 months later, Harborview's town hall bustled with the hum of voices and the faint strains of a string quartet playing near the stage. A banner hung across the back wall, the Harper Lane Foundation. Opportunity through technology and rescue. The foundation's mission was twofold: scholarships for young women in foster care pursuing technology education, and a new training program for rescue dogs, honoring both Sophie's journey and Atlas's legacy. Margaret moved through the crowd with a composed grace, greeting donors, city officials, and former foster children alike. The years had not erased the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but there was a new openness in her smile now, a gentler cadence to her voice. Ethan worked the edges of the room, introducing himself to young scholarship recipients, shaking hands with local rescue volunteers. Sophie, dressed in a simple navy dress, stood near the front of the stage, speaking to Claire Jennings, the program's first scholarship recipient, a shy 18-year-old with straight black hair and a tentative smile. Claire had grown up in the same foster home Sophie once had, and her quiet determination reminded Sophie of herself at that age. At the appointed hour, the crowd gathered before the stage. Margaret, Ethan, and Sophie stepped up together, Atlas settling at Sophie's feet. The white scarf was back, this time embroidered with a small gold sun at its center. Cameras clicked as Margaret spoke, her voice steady but warm. "This foundation is built not just on the idea of opportunity, but on the belief that family is something we can choose, something we can build, sometimes from the unlikeliest of beginnings." Ethan spoke next, recounting how Atlas's bond with Michael Lane had bridged past and present, and how rescue, whether of people or of possibilities, was the heart of the program. When Sophie's turn came, she didn't speak of loss or hardship. Instead, she said, Every one of us here has been carried forward by someone's choice to care. Today is about making those choices for someone else. As the applause swelled, Atlas lifted his head toward the crowd. Though he could not see the faces, he seemed to look at them. The tilt of his head almost regal, his ears catching the waves of clapping like an unseen map. From where she stood, Sophie swore she could feel the moment settle, like the tide turning, like the first breath after a long dive. When the speeches ended, the three of them remained on stage together. Margaret, Ethan, Sophie, with Atlas lying between them, head high, tail curled neatly by his side. It was not a perfect family, not in the traditional sense, but it was theirs, built from mistakes, from loss, from unlikely reunions, and above all, from the decision to stand together. The morning light through the tall windows caught the twin pendants at Margaret's and Sophie's throats, turning them into small suns burning steadily against the blue. And for the first time in many years, Margaret felt she was no longer guarding a secret. She was holding a future. Sometimes God works in ways we cannot see at first. A lost child, a blind dog, a family broken by time. These may seem like fragments, but in His hands, they become pieces of a greater plan. What we think is chance is often a door He has quietly prepared for years. Margaret, Sophie, Ethan, and Atlas did not find each. Other by accident, they were guided step by step into a moment only God could design. In our daily lives, we may not face lighthouses or storms, but we all face moments when we must choose. Choose forgiveness over pride, hope over despair, faith over fear. And when we make those choices, we take part in the miracles God is still working every day. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that family can be found, healing is possible, and God is still writing beautiful endings. Comment below with one word, Amen, if you believe He still brings people together in His perfect timing. Subscribe for more stories that shine His light, and may God bless you and everyone you love.